Welcome to today's episode of Cheerful to Stormy, the everyday podcast with Ollie Schmidt. Today, we are talking about mental health in the workplace. My guest today is Dr. Eva Elisa Schneider, an expert in mental health, a PhD psychotherapist, speaker and trainer. She also has her own podcast, Gesund Arbeiten. In October, her new book, Mental Health Matters, will be released. It covers the very topic we will discuss today. How can we design our work in a way that promotes our mental health rather than burdens it? Hello, dear Eva.
Hi, Ollie. Nice to be here.
I'm glad you're here and have taken the time. Today, we're talking about myths related to work and mental health. You've brought us a total of 5 myths. But before we get to those myths, I'd like to know from you, have you ever felt that a job or a task made you sick?
Yes, there were definitely phases in my professional life where I felt like I was really on the edge, you could say, just very close to burnout. But it was never a specific job because the jobs and the work I did always brought me immense joy. So what I do with all my heart and complete passion. I think it was more about the quantity, not the content, but rather the number of tasks or projects that I had taken on too much, where I felt if I didn't correct my course, it could go in a completely different direction.
And here we are already in the middle of the first myth. Work makes you sick. You already hinted at the direction this is going. What do you think, where does this idea come from that work makes you sick?
Yes, of course. It's a very easy statement at first to say my job is making me sick. And with that, you just want to signal, hey, the way my work is right now, it's simply not good for me. That's the message behind it, and it's causing me some health problems. Be it mental or psychological, that we just feel like, wow, this may not fit me at all, or it's simply too much of a workout, I can't manage it. Or maybe the relationships with colleagues or supervisors are somehow difficult. Those can all be things that can burden you mentally or even physically. There are also people who do a lot of physical work and say, hey, what I'm doing there in that form, I really can't continue like this because it's making me sick, because my body is sending me signals, for example, through physical pain like headaches, back pain, neck pain, or something like stomach problems, or because you might have trouble sleeping. All those can be signals where either the psyche or the body is just giving you a hint, hey, the work seems to be a factor that is somehow not good for me. And then, of course, you want to do something about it. And initially, it is, of course, an easy and generalized statement to say my work is making me sick.
You can't generalize like that. Do you have any experience from your therapeutic work where this myth has come up before, and how did you work with it?
Yes, so I always find it important to say, and I have also experienced this a lot with my clients, that work can certainly be a very big stress factor, which can influence our mental health negatively, but also positively. Of course, the question is in which direction it goes. And with my clients, it was very often the case that work was unfortunately more of a negative factor in their daily lives. For example, because there were conflicts with colleagues, because the workload was too high, or because they had the feeling that they actually wanted to do something completely different, but out of a lack of alternatives, they felt forced to stay with their employer, even though they might not enjoy the task or would actually like to reorient themselves. But maybe there are no positions currently advertised in their area, or because they might also have a financial dependence. So all of this can create massive pressure and lead to us feeling stressed, exhausted, and constantly running on empty. I have experienced this very often with my clients. And it can then lead to developing something like burnout, anxiety disorders, depression, etc. And there are many different forms of disorders. What is important to me to say is that work alone is never the sole reason or factor for developing a certain disorder, a mental illness. It is one of many factors that can have a very large influence, but generally in psychology it is always the case that we speak of multifactorial reasons. So there are many different reasons why we may end up in overload at a very specific point in time. And we can never say it is really just this one thing. And I also find this important for education because the blanket statement, my work makes me sick, is of course very one-dimensional thinking. And when you look a bit more behind the scenes, you often realize, okay, maybe there was a lot going on at home, there was some unrest in the family, then maybe the sister fell ill with some disease, then there was the move, then the separation, and many things come together, making it clear that it wasn't just work alone that led to the current state of being overwhelmed.
So, if someone tells me that their work is making them sick, Or if I feel like my work is making me sick, then I have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and see what's going on.
That's what's happening. Exactly. Although one should definitely take it seriously. So if someone says my work is making me sick, then you should definitely take a closer look, but also consider other areas of life and listen carefully again.
And on the other hand, you just said that work can also have a stabilizing effect.
That's absolutely right.
What has your experience been like?
Yes, well, all these statements like work makes me sick, I already mentioned, are just very one-dimensional. In reality, though, work is also an incredibly important stabilizing pillar in everyday life for many people. For instance, it gives them a daily structure. I go somewhere in the morning, I spend my time there, and I come back in the evening. So I have this external structure that I can adhere to, and I don't have to organize my day myself from within. For many people, it also provides a sense of purpose. Many people really enjoy what they do. I mean, they didn't end up in their professions by accident. Work also provides social contacts, which is super important. For example, we know from resilience research that social contacts and being connected to a social network, having close and trusted people around you, is a huge buffer against stress. It's one of the most well-researched factors of resilience that if we have good, strong social networks, it incredibly equips us to handle stress. And it's the same at work. We often have specific colleagues we particularly enjoy working with or spending time with. For many people, it's genuinely fulfilling to go to work knowing, oh, I'll see Anna there and these specific individuals. Many also say when they resign and leave their employer, it's not so much the job or the employer they will miss, but their colleagues, the people they say, oh, it really hurts to leave them. So this is just a completely underestimated factor that we often completely overlook, how important these people we work with actually are. And this in turn helps stabilize us, makes us feel good and maintain our mental well-being.
Good social relationships are the spice of life. There's this grand study, the large study at the Harvard Medical School. There's a great book, The Good Life by Robert Waldinger, who currently leads this study. Very, very exciting. So you can check it out if you are interested. In our preliminary conversation, you mentioned 4 other myths that we want to delve into a bit more today. Maybe you'd like to briefly mention those 4, and then we'll look at them individually. The first myth was that work makes you sick. But you also brought up 4 other myths during our preliminary talk. Perhaps you could name them briefly, and then we'll examine each of them in detail.
Yes, of course, very gladly. I want to emphasize again that these are myths, but we will go into more detail on them shortly. So the first myth we discussed was that work makes you sick. Another one was that if you're depressed, you can't work. Another one was that everyone needs therapy. Another myth was once sick, always sick. And the last myth was that burnout is my own fault.
Exactly. There's a lot to unpack. And now we're going to take a look at all the myths. The first myth is that people with depression cannot work, or you could extend it to mental illnesses in general. But let's take depression as an example here. What do you say about this thesis? Can people with depression or mental illnesses really not work?
That is total nonsense. Most people who have a mental illness or depression being one of many mental illnesses, actually do work. One reason for that, as I already mentioned, is because it's a really important stabilizing pillar in their daily life, and they often say they want to work. Very few people with depression say, oh, I really want to stay home. They are so affected by their illness that staying home isn't necessarily advantageous for them because it often leads to a lack of daily structure, causing them to spiral further down, avoid people, and find everyday tasks increasingly difficult. This continues on and on, making it generally negative to stay home for a long time when you have depression. There are cases where it makes sense, but for most people, it's very helpful to go to work. Of course, employers need to consider what workplace adjustments might be necessary. For example, many people say they are very sensitive to noise and stimuli during such phases. So it might make sense for someone who usually works in an open plan office to ask, how can we create a quieter work environment? Perhaps they could work in a single or double office for a while. When you inform the employer and request such adjustments, it's called a workplace adaptation suitable for the illness. And in this case, the employer is actually obligated to set that up. That may be an important message for many people. You don't have to tell the employer, but there's the option to share it. Then the employer has to take care of it. You can discuss individually what the exact options can be. And I think it's crucial to understand that it's not just about there being no alternative. It's not just about working or not working, but about working under slightly different conditions that are better suited to my current illness and thus beneficial for everyone involved. The employer is happy that you can work, and you yourself notice, okay, great, I have a daily structure, I can abide by it, and it does me good to continue working.
That means, however, it is also an encouragement to deal transparently with one's own illness.
Yes, one should mention that this is, of course, a very individual decision. I discussed this in my book, covering arguments that support it and those that oppose it. Certainly, it can be very advantageous for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but there can also be reasons why someone might say, no, I don't feel comfortable with it. Or I need to come to terms with it myself first and find my own way of dealing with this diagnosis. For some, it might be the first time that someone professionally points out to them, hey, what you're experiencing is depression. Or because people sometimes say they are simply afraid of others' reactions. There are also certain industries where mental illnesses are more heavily stigmatized than others, which might make someone feel uncomfortable with it. So it's really important to find a good personal and individual path. I definitely wrote about this in my book, so feel free to read it. Additionally, there is a great website called sagix.de, which provides excellent suggestions on the pros and cons of disclosing an illness. It deals not only with mental illnesses, but also with other types of illnesses. So it's a great thought aid.
Great tip. Thank you very much. We'll definitely include that in the show notes. sagix.de. Eva, the second myth you've brought for us, which is the third overall, is that everyone needs therapy.
Yes, especially when you look around on social media, it's often said that everyone should go to therapy at some point. And indeed, psychotherapy is for people who have a mental illness. It's similar to going to a doctor for high blood pressure. The treatment is specifically for those who have high blood pressure. You don't just go and say you want treatment for high blood pressure if you don't have it. So it's important to note that psychotherapy is for those with a clinical diagnosis of a mental illness diagnosed by a professional. Self-diagnosis isn't enough. It's really important to consult with a professional, especially when there's a significant amount of distress. Let me give an example, as sometimes there are some gray areas. There are people who might say they're generally very anxious and think they would benefit from psychotherapy. That might be the case. But if the anxiety reaches a point where you can't leave the house because you're afraid of being around people or using public transportation because it might be too crowded and you can't get to work because of it, or in the case of panic disorders, where the fear of another panic attack is so great that you leave your door open all day to ensure help can quickly get in because you don't feel able to do it yourself. These are all things and examples that severely limit the quality of life, where you notice, okay, this hinders me so much in my daily routine, in a regular, normal daily routine, because I, for example, can no longer go to work, because I can no longer use public transportation out of great fear. Then it is so significantly impactful for daily life that you would say, hey, this is really a relevant suffering, a significant psychological burden, and psychotherapy is needed. In such cases, going to coaching would not help because it massively affects everyday life. Or if, for example, you no longer take care of personal hygiene because you might have such a severe depression that you can't take care of yourself anymore. I've witnessed that too. Then you have reached a stage where you would say, yes, psychotherapy is definitely necessary. And now we are no longer debating the question of whether it's coaching or psychotherapy.
So a high level of suffering and daily life restrictions are 2 points where one would say therapy should be considered. You've just mentioned that we no longer talk about coaching at this point. What are some typical reasons for seeking coaching?
Yes, I also find it important to discuss this because coaching is often presented as a cure-all for various problems. And I believe coaching is very, very important and a great option. But coaching is generally more resource-oriented in the here and now, I would describe it that way. And for very specific life questions, like when you want to change your career, improve your communication, delve into self-reflection, or understand certain patterns better, but without any clinical suffering that causes significant daily impairments. I mentioned some examples earlier. Sometimes it can blur a bit. It can happen that people do both. They undergo psychotherapy because they have a major issue they'd like to tackle, and at the same time they do coaching for career reorientation. These don't exclude each other at all. What's important in coaching and what characterizes good coaches from my point of view is clearly highlighting possibilities and limits. As a coach, you need to say, I can help you in these areas up to this point, and beyond that, I can't help you further. I see that you might have challenges in multiple aspects of life, but this is my scope of practice, and I can help you here while another person must help you there. So really making those limits clear. Hence, it's entirely possible to do both, perhaps even in parallel or in different life phases, sometimes one, sometimes the other. You could say that, but also always seek advice in case of doubt. I always strongly advocate getting professional advice.
Yes, I think that's very, very important because this market, especially when it comes to mental health, is incredibly large. So it starts with some Instagram junk and goes up to some high-priced coaching packages that promise everything. That's why I find this distinction very, very important.
Exactly. Yes, I also think that as soon as it becomes sensational, like you said, as soon as everything is promised, you should always approach it with a bit of skepticism. You can always have a preliminary conversation and see, hey, does this person somehow match my initial feeling? Does this offer suit me? But always approach it with a critical eye. And by the way, this also applies to psychotherapy. So if you're sitting with a therapist and you feel like they just don't resonate with you at all, or you don't feel comfortable with them, it's an important signal to say, no, then this is not the right person. It has to be someone else. Because naturally, you have to assume that over the course of such treatment or even a coaching process, you might talk about very personal or intimate matters. And you need to feel 100% comfortable discussing these matters with that exact person.
Exactly. So the chemistry between the client and the therapist is incredibly important in this process. If the chemistry isn't right, it doesn't help, even if the therapist is good.
Then it could be the best therapist, then it works too. Otherwise, you're just throwing away the potential of psychotherapy. Exactly.
We just mentioned that the market is incredibly large, but maybe you have some more ideas about which other possibilities exist. There are an incredible number of serious ways to boost mental health.
Yes, coaching is, as mentioned, an option. However, you should always critically examine the qualifications behind it. The same applies to psychological counseling. It's important to always thoroughly check what qualifications and experience are behind it, especially when there are offers that I'd say seem a bit dubious with their healing promises. For example, I healed trauma with 2 hypnosis sessions. I'd be skeptical because that's a field where comprehensive treatment is often necessary, particularly in psychotherapy. So, as I said, I'd be cautious with sensational offers. What can be very helpful, though, is psychological counseling or support. Many companies have what's called EAPs, employee assistance programs. You at PME also have similar offers where you can speak with external independent people. This is funded by the employer and is a great option because the employer isn't notified when you use this service. It's completely anonymous, but you still get someone to talk to about a specific issue. For example, if you have a conflict with a colleague, find it hard to prioritize your tasks, feel overwhelmed, or have been unusually irritable lately without knowing why, you might need some support. So it's very worthwhile to see what the employer offers. Maybe there's a hotline or something like video calls. That can be incredibly helpful. Besides that, if you're simply interested in the topic, the internet is full of resources. I can definitely recommend following certain accounts or reading specific books. As I said, my book will be out soon. It's good to engage in self-reflection, maybe talk with friends, because the more you start to look deeper into yourself, the more opportunities seem to open up, and you don't always need external help for that. What's important is that you seek out input and see how you can apply it to your own life or where it fits into your own life.
In short, talking helps. And as you just mentioned, Eva, we are actually an EAP provider and we naturally offer exactly what you mentioned. More information can be found on our website, Familienservice.de. Let's move on to the next myth, which states, once sick, always sick. Fortunately, we know that's not true. But how do such strange and harmful perspectives arise?
Yes, I definitely believe that this is the result of decades of societal stigmatization, also because for a very long time mental illnesses were considered a private matter and people were just expected to deal with it themselves. And it just wasn't talked about. This means that those affected didn't really have the chance to say, hey, I might be going through a depressive phase right now, but there are also times when I feel really good and don't have depression. So there wasn't really the chance to dispel these myths, or for a long time, there wasn't the chance to really clear up these myths. And through social media, we now experience much greater awareness and also much greater acceptance of talking about this topic. And people suddenly realize, what I'm experiencing, others are too. And, okay, just because I got this diagnosis once doesn't mean I'll suffer from it forever. For example, we know that certain conditions like anxiety disorders are very treatable and have a high success rate in treatments. So if you have it and if you recognize it early and get early treatment, the chances are very high that you can recover from it. And that's a very important message that often gets lost under societal stigmatization and tabooing. And I think it's important that we start talking much, much more about it. And social media, for example, is really a great Kickstarter for that. Although, of course, sometimes misinformation circulates. I always highly recommend following truly reputable accounts and serious individuals, checking their qualifications and seeing if there's someone behind it who really knows what they're doing, or if it's just a self-proclaimed mental health coach who might not have the proper qualifications. So this credibility check is just good to know if the information I'm getting is legitimate and reliable, or if I should take it with a grain of salt.
So, we've already mentioned that it's good to talk about it if you can, if you're able to. The employer also has the opportunity to support the return. What role do colleagues and supervisors in general play in the return to work?
Yes, they are immensely important because they really help to promote acceptance. So it's not only about self-acceptance, like me knowing, okay, I had a burnout, I'm returning to work now, and that's okay, it happened. And now we are doing everything we can to ensure it doesn't happen again and to learn from it. It's also important, among other things, to show that these phenomena exist. We don't sweep them under the rug, but rather we acknowledge them and make sure we create an environment that promotes health instead of burdening it. This collective responsibility is crucial because everything related to mental health is often still stamped as something one has to deal with alone, as a pure healthcare issue, so to speak. And we totally underestimate the impact that common care or mutual care can have. For instance, recognizing things early. Ollie, if you were to tell me, hey Ava, over the past 2 weeks, you seemed a bit short, you never wanted to have a quick chat, you seemed really stressed, you had tired eyes, you become a mirror for me. I then realize, you're right, I was so caught up in it all in this whirlwind that I didn't even notice it myself. So colleagues can be a very important mirror for us, maybe recognizing early signs of overload, or even if we have slipped into full burnout and are coming back, as I said, to promote acceptance and also to ensure together that we create a healthier environment, because that's never the sole responsibility of an individual. Rather, we always look at the individual, but also at the surroundings. And we all can significantly shape this environment and the work culture we work in, for example, through awareness, acceptance, and normalizing these conversations. So there are now very, very, very many things through which this can happen. I've also written a lot about this in my book, but our surroundings definitely play a very important role in normalizing it and truly saying it's okay not to be okay.
That's very, very important. It's okay not to be okay. And it's not your personal fault. And also, with that, we come to the fifth and final myth you brought with you. Burnout is also not your personal fault. But where does the idea come from that it could be?
Yes, well, the idea again comes from the societal belief that, well, you simply overworked yourself. You worked so much that you're, of course, responsible if you can't handle it anymore. And that's really short-sighted. Burnout often still surprises me. I'm often shocked that so many people think it's their own fault. Burnout always has two sides. On one hand, there are individual factors that can contribute to it. For example, being very perfectionistic, having a tendency to overexert yourself, or not being good at recognizing your own signals, like your body notifying you early on. For instance, we might already have physical pain or sleeping problems, but we're really good at ignoring them, saying, oh, it'll be fine somehow. These could be individual factors contributing to the development of burnout. But we also always deal with so-called systemic or environmental factors. This could be, for example, receiving very little recognition in our workplace, having an enormous workload that's objectively unmanageable. It's not just me feeling that I can't keep up, but it's really too much, or we lack resources like staff, time, money. Everything is lacking everywhere. When these environmental factors are present, of course, these individual tendencies, like overextending myself, naturally find fertile ground. When the workload is extremely high and I just want to work and do everything really well, I tend to push myself beyond my limits. This combination can lead to burnout. However, it's never just my own fault. It's a combination of certain personal traits and environmental factors that create a toxic mix, leading to burnout.
And then there are also people who, in certain environments, wear burnout like a badge of honor. Yes, I was passionate about something. I worked hard for it. I've heard that too. Yes.
Yes, I sometimes find it a bit critical, I must say, because of course it's important to talk about things like burnout. However, burnout is somewhat more recognized because if you worked a lot, society sees it as relatively acceptable. They say, okay, you just worked really hard, you really threw yourself into it. But if you say, I have depression or I might even have an alcohol problem, it's like, whoa, that's totally unacceptable. So there's still a significant stigma about what we consider okay and what we think, oh no, you don't talk about that, or that's not really acceptable. I really think we have to be careful about what we as a society consider as basically okay and what we categorize into a more stigmatized corner. I think it's important to talk about it, but also with a certain reverence and humility regarding what it might mean for other affected individuals.
This means that companies and society can do something to support people, possibly to help them avoid falling into the burnout trap.
Definitely, exactly. I just mentioned environmental factors. So companies have a significant responsibility to look at how they can create conditions that make healthy behavior possible. For example, if we work in an environment where we receive recognition, where we can express our critical remarks, where we have sufficient resources, and where we are encouraged to leave work on time, like when our supervisor says, hey, Ollie, I think it's great that you say, look, it's 5:30 p.m., I'm going home, everything else will be done tomorrow, then it helps us feel more confident in setting boundaries. This way, our own healthy behaviors become more achievable in the right environment. You'll be more inclined to say, okay, it's important for me to be with my family and children, or it's important to me to do my sports or whatever I have planned for my mental health. Suddenly, it becomes much easier and more accepted to follow through with these in that environment. So conditions always create behavior, and the behavior is only possible when the conditions are right.
I had to think about this sentence for a moment, but yes, that's right. It means that behavior determines relationships. In that sense, it would be nice if supervisors in particular could lead by example.
Exactly the other way around. The circumstances determine the behavior. So when I'm in an environment where the conditions are right, my health-promoting behavior can flourish. That means if my manager sets the conditions, the structural environment, and says, hey, I think it's great if we all pay attention to our health. I think it's great that you set your boundaries. I think it's great that you say, I can't take on this project because I am completely maxed out. Then you can also feel more confident in showing your behavior, like setting boundaries, or maybe saying something that doesn't sit well with you, or sharing a tip that's particularly helpful for your health, etc. Yes, interesting.
I find it really, really good that we are looking at this topic from this perspective again, in order to take away some of the supposed guilt from each individual. Yes, everyone is responsible for dealing with it themselves, but the theme of guilt is certainly not very helpful here. Eva, we have now discussed these 5 myths. From your perspective, are there any other misunderstandings regarding work and mental health that you think we should at least mention here?
Yes, I think there are 2 more things I'd like to mention. Firstly, this general misconception that mental health doesn't belong in the workplace is complete nonsense, because wherever there are people, there is mental health. It's something entirely natural, inherently part of us. Our psyche is such a clear, important, inseparable part of us that it naturally manifests in the workplace. We can't just shed it like a jacket at the door. It definitely plays a role at work. The second misconception is that we often want to shift the responsibility onto others when it comes to mental health. Like, my manager should change, or the company should change, or this person should change. And it's true that certain key people, such as managers, have significant influence that they should utilize more. I see a lot in my work that there's still not enough focus on the importance of this issue. But in the end, we can all start somewhere, and we can all contribute to mental health for ourselves and in our teams. It doesn't always have to be in a huge company with, say, 8,000 employees. Sometimes it's just our small ecosystem where in our team we say, hey, let's establish a small mental health check-in before each meeting. Or I dare to share a resource that has really helped me, or it suddenly becomes normal to talk about my last therapy session in the coffee kitchen with my team. It doesn't always have to be a huge effort. We can start small and we can all contribute. And it's not just a one-way street that starts with a single person or a key person. It can come from all of us, and we can all contribute to a health-promoting culture.
And for those who have been listening attentively and thought, wow, the topic is absolutely fascinating, and I also enjoy listening to Eva, you can now be excited. Because Eva, you are not only with us on the podcast today, but you will also be at the Health Day organized by PME Familienservice on October 10th. Maybe you could briefly outline what you will be talking about there.
Exactly, yes. I'm really looking forward to it. It will be about a slightly different topic that's also very much related to mental health at the workplace, namely digitalization and AI, and what all that actually does to us. So everything around digital mental health, many of us nowadays work a lot remotely and deal with the challenges of digitalization and artificial intelligence. There are often a lot of worries and fears, and I'll be talking about that. I'm really excited about it.
So it's definitely worth being there. On October 10th for Mental Health Day. No, it's Health Day. That's what it's called by us at PME Family Service. And we will hear from you again, Eva. Thank you very much for your insights and for your time. And maybe you have one ultimate tip for our listeners on how they can manage to stay mentally healthy.
Yes, I don't just have one, I have three, my top three. The first one is that we should all make sure to use our energy stations well, because we have things that drain us, our energy vampires. And you should always balance this with going to your energy stations. For example, meeting your favorite people, doing your sport, having your we time. This looks very different for each person. The second tip is to always surround yourself with people who recharge you and are really good for you. I mentioned earlier that our social network and social relationships are very important factors for our well-being. And my third tip is to take real breaks, maybe a small anecdote here. I also do therapy, and my therapist once told me I should take more real breaks. I looked at her like, what does she mean by real breaks? I do take breaks. And she was like, kind of. Because often during my breaks, I'm on social media, reading something, listening to a podcast, quickly unloading the dishwasher, or watering the plants. So I just put her around during breaks. And actually, this sometimes means that when I'm listening to a podcast, for example, it doesn't let me really wind down because my mind keeps working as I'm listening and thinking about it. And that really resonated with me when she said it should be a real break. So really turn everything off, sit down quietly, or take a calm walk without a phone or anything. Just being in the current moment, being really mindful and not trying to juggle a second, third or fourth thing at the same time. I think this does us a lot of good, especially in times of constant availability when our phones are always just a few centimeters away, to truly switch off and take real breaks now and then.
Dear Eva, thank you so much for your time and for being here. And to everyone who has stayed with us until now, thank you for listening. As always, we really appreciate feedback at podcast@familienservice.de. And now, I wish you a nice day, evening, or morning, depending on when you listen to this episode.